Whether or not you're a fan, if you're a gamer, you've probably played or at least heard of Halo. Now, the latest installment in the Halo franchise isn't the typical first-person shooter that you'd expect from the other ones, but instead it's a top-down shooter, Halo Spartan Assault. The game devs at 343 Industries and Vanguard Games did a lot of great work on the effects for this game. Notice here how there's some nice snow falling from the sky, but you've also got light wisps of snow blowing across the ground as well. Or in this shot, watch as the machine gun sprays shots, grenades get thrown, and explosions ensue. If you look closely, you'll notice there's little particles that go flying from the balls of fire and a really nice plume of smoke in the aftermath of the explosion. A lot of the explosions look really, really good. And these little details are definitely one of the biggest things that we really enjoyed about Spartan Assault. And what's one thing you got to do at least once anytime you're playing a top-down shooter? Spin around like crazy, of course. Okay, so a little more seriously. You've probably noticed in just the few shots that we've looked at so far how great looking the environments are. What really helps add to these is the layering that 343 and Vanguard added to the game. In this shot, take a look at the top of the screen. There's a whole other layer to this environment with what looks like wraiths and banshees and a vicious battle on a whole other layer than where we're at. It's a great little touch that really helped add a whole new level of realism to the game. Pun intended. Then again, sometimes that layered effect actually was a detriment to the game. For example, here we're exploring the map and it looks like we might be able to go over there, but nope, that's actually the edge of the map that's pretty cleverly blended with the rest of the map, but only once you know it's there. And a lot of times you won't know it's there because the edge of the map in many areas is this big giant blue wall like you can see in this shot. And the result is there's a lot of times where you'll hit the edge of the map without even knowing it's there because it's not this big blue wall that you might be looking for, but instead it's blended really well into the rest of the map. Now, even though a top-down view isn't what you'd expect from a Halo game, these environments look like a Halo world. Everything is beautifully modeled and textured with a stunning amount of continuity across all of the various levels. For example, in Spartan Assault, we go from snowy cliffs to massive battles in sandy deserts, to strange alien worlds with whatever these plants are here. Remember the nice snow effects from one of the shots earlier? Notice how in this environment we don't have snow anymore, but there's still some really nice particles in the light. If you look closely, you can see what looks like pretty decent-sized sprites floating around to get this effect, but it looks really, really nice and again helps add to the game. Of course, there were some technical issues that we found that broke some of the continuity throughout the game. For example, most of the lighting in Spartan Assault looks like it's baked. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can make the assets that don't have baked lighting stand out that much more. In this shot, look closely at the barrels here in the scene. Here, let's pause the video for a bit so you can see the barrels without the distraction of the fighting going on. Notice the yellow barrels towards the bottom of the screen? If you notice, they have really nice shadows around them and they blend into the environment really, really well. But the red barrels right next to them don't have any shadows under them, and as a result, they stick out from the environment. This is simply because the red barrels are the ones you can blow up. The yellow barrels are permanent fixtures in the environment that you can't interact with. So from a technical perspective, it makes perfect sense why there's no baked lighting on the red barrels, because it looks silly to have a shadow there once you blew up the barrel. But that's one of the downsides of working with baked lighting alongside objects that need interactivity. Now, another instance of where the overall use of baked lighting stood out to us was when our character was running in the shade. For example, in this shot, pay close attention to our Spartan as he's running in the sunlight and then into the shade. Did you see a difference in the character lighting when he goes into the shade? Nope, that's because the shade is actually baked into the ground textures, so it's not interacting with the character model as it moves. There's no light there to do that. Now, these sort of issues are technical limitations of baking your lights into textures that don't really have an effect on the gameplay itself, but they're still things that you should keep in mind anytime you're working with baked lighting, because if you're not careful, it could end up taking the player out of the game. Now, even if you end up deciding the benefits of baked lighting outweigh the cons of getting some minor inconsistencies like what we looked at with the barrels and the character lighting, it's always better that you make sure you consciously make that decision for your game. Now, since we're on the subject of lighting, you might have noticed that the shadows for all the characters so far are basically the same radial gradient reused. There's actually quite a bit of textures that get reused throughout the game. For example, here we're getting some help from someone on Xbox Live to fend off flood attacks, and notice how the green bad guy blood splattered on the ground after dying is really just the same texture that's rotated around differently and placed differently. Or when this bad guy comes flying in and we take him out, the residue left on the ground after he dies is a collection of the same texture repeated over and over. But this doesn't happen only when bad guys die. Dynamic textures are repeated when a Wraith's big shot hits the ground, like you can see here. And actually, let's pause this video again, because if you look closely at the textures on the ground, you'll notice the exact same texture that's being used for a lot of the white, icy areas. Can you see them? Here, let's highlight them just so that it's a little bit easier to see. Sure, they're rotated around differently, and it even looks like the one on the far left is stretched a little to fit the geometry, but you can still tell that they're the same texture being reused, and you'll find a lot of this throughout Halo Spartan Assault. Of course, with everything else going on in the environment, those little details are very easy to overlook. You're not going to pause the game every time just to look at those. So when you're in the middle of a big battle with enemies closing in on all sides, you're probably not going to notice it. So in the end, Halo Spartan Assault is a game that's really well done technically for a top-down shooter. But for those of us reviewing the game, we thought its biggest downfalls actually came from really the genre itself. So, well, we won't really talk about them in this review, and they didn't affect our scores because they're outside the scope of what we're looking at for this technical review. It is worth mentioning that, simply put, the game itself is pretty short, and the gameplay that there is can get pretty repetitive, so don't expect to be playing it for hours on end. If you do happen to pick it up, feel free to look for us on Xbox Live with the gamer tag Digital-Tutors, and we'll see you online.